So today, more or less, we're going to discuss how FireSmart's critical infrastructure guidance can be applied to renewable energy. At this stage, we don't have anything specific to renewable energy, but realistically, a lot of these concepts will be kind of applicable across the board. Really, if you look at FireSmart from a program standpoint, we not not out of I don't know. Where am I going with this? A lot of the concepts are applicable really across the board for a lot of different issues. So we look at ignition zones, and those can be applied from the home to infrastructure. So that's really what we're going to be talking about here today. So as was in my introduction there, FireSmart is a set of science-backed guidelines and principles that aim to reduce and mitigate wildfire hazard in the wildland-urban interface. And really the goal of FireSmart is to disrupt that ignition chain from the forested wildland fuels into the built fuels, so our urban environments, homes, and in this case, critical infrastructure pieces. Just a little bit of a basic to kind of, I wasn't sure of necessarily the background of the audience here, but just set up sort of baseline understanding of how wildfires really move across the landscape. There's a little bit of a misconception. People tend to visualize fires as a big wall of flames descending down onto a community, where that in some cases is the case, but more often than not, we're seeing ember ignition being the real driving factors in moving fires across landscapes. And that really ties into the FireSmart concepts that we're going to cover later in this presentation. So we see embers and firebrands. That's our number one driver. That's really pushing fires quickly across landscapes. And then to a lesser degree, we see conduction, convection, and radiation as those fires consume fuels, preheat fuels ahead of them, and then continue their progression across. As far as how structures ignite during a wildfire, these are kind of the main entry points to fire into structures that we see. So embers enter via cracks, holes, gaps. They ignite fine fuels and vegetations around structures. They accumulate. If you look at inside corners on decks and things like that, that's where areas where embers will accumulate, produce enough heat to start some combustion, and then ultimately start to ignite structures. Direct flames are typically, we'll see, stacks of building materials, vehicles, those sorts of things adjacent to structures will ignite from embers or from direct flames from adjacent fuels again, and then cause structures to ignite that way. And then radiant heat, again, from those same sort of fuels existing around structures. If they aren't close enough to have that direct flame contact with structures, the radiant heat from them igniting will then ultimately preheat fuels to that critical point where they will ignite. And then, yeah, just back to the first graphic, I pulled a lot of this stuff directly out of the critical infrastructure guidance documents that we have on FireSmart BC. So this just outlines your ignition zones, which anyone familiar with the FireSmart Begins at Home guide and any of our guidance surrounding homes, it's the same designations for those ignition zones. So we're looking at immediate, intermediate, and extended zones. So if we start with the immediate zone, this is, for all intents and purposes, the non-combustible zone. This is the zone where it's super critical to have nothing that's going to be ignited by embers. So you're looking at getting rid of any sort of vegetation, any leaves, any debris, building materials, those sorts of things, and then making sure that your structure itself is more or less fire hardened and resistant to any sort of ember infiltration into cracks, crevices, those sorts of things that would then ultimately result in a structure loss. Apologies, this is a lot of words on one slide, but this more or less outlines kind of the considerations that you want to take into looking at the components of these structures, doors and windows, having those be fire rated, siding tending towards a non-combustible, whether it's cement board or metal siding, foundation skirting, making sure that you have that minimum of 15 centimeters or 6 inches of non-combustible between the ground and the beginning of your siding surface. Roofs and flashing, again, making sure that that's fire rated and in place. Soffits and eaves, making sure that you don't have open eaves. We're seeing From our structural loss research, eaves, soffits are a main entry point into structures for fires to start that structure ignition and ultimately structure loss. So being able to have your eaves closed is a huge point for keeping those embers out and as well saving the structure. And then because we're talking about large infrastructure sites, the HVAC concerns are something that should be considered. And this is, I'll touch on this again later in the presentation, but making sure that when you're following these FireSmart guidelines, you're doing it in consultation with an engineer and the people who are designing your buildings to make sure that it's compatible with the infrastructure that you're running. So when we talk about HVAC being able to remotely shut down or have an operator on site to shut down that HVAC so that you're not inadvertently sucking embers into your structure, making sure that that isn't then going to result in your infrastructure overheating or causing damage or fire in another way. So that's really I think luckily with looking at renewable energy infrastructure, and because this is new and emerging, a lot of the infrastructure is currently being built and we're not necessarily retrofitting existing infrastructure. So taking this into account in that sort of planning phase and having those conversations with the experts on HVAC and the needs of that infrastructure are really key to having all of the systems in place to be able to have essentially infrastructure that you'll be able to walk away from in event of an emergency or wildfire and know that it's going to be safe and be able to operate again when you're able to return. Again, here are just some images from the critical infrastructure guide, just illustrating obviously this roof in the first picture seems to be in pretty poor condition. So these would be things if you were retrofitting existing infrastructure, this would be a big flag to get a good new roof on this structure. And then yeah, these wide open eaves, obviously that's going to be just a very easy entry point for embers and our fire to get into these structures. So keeping that sort of stuff in mind. Again, with the combustibles, we look at this as some wood skirting, probably on some type of portable prefabricated building, interfacing directly with some dead grass. So obviously, if you were to get ignition anywhere around this building at this point, it would probably be a loss. Where this has this nice concrete interface between the building and the surrounding non-combustible, which would, very much harden this building against that sort of ember ignition. Again, open foundations. Just making sure the first picture you can see there's a huge accumulation of needles and debris under that building. So if you were to get an ember in there, that would very readily ignite versus you're not necessarily going to have decks or things on your critical infrastructure, but thinking of staircases, any sort of thing like that, making sure that you're down to a non-combustible mineral or gravel underneath that, just to make sure that nothing is going to ignite and ultimately catch that structure on fire and then be able to spread to anything adjacent. And then your third sort of consideration for the immediate zone is vehicle parking. Making sure that you have your vehicles removed from that immediate intermediate zone, getting them as far away as possible if you're going to store vehicles on site, making sure that they're stored on a non-combustible surface, making sure that all the windows and doors are closed. You don't want embers getting into those vehicles and lighting them on fire. Obviously, there's a lot of flammable petrochemicals and components of vehicles that once they are ignited, they will burn and cause potentially a significant amount of damage as a result. And then just making sure that those vehicles, if they are parked for a long period of time, aren't leaking any fluids, any sort of flammable liquids in the area that could then add to the fuel loading. As we move into that intermediate zone around critical infrastructure buildings, this is where we get into vegetation management. I would think in a lot of these infrastructure areas, we'd be at the very most kind of mowed grass in these areas, and that's where you want to very much manage that if you're not just down to gravel. Making sure that it's low cut grass well maintained, and then again with the making sure you don't have piles of lumber, fuel barrels, vehicles, and things stored in this area. Basically, the further that you can move any of that stuff away from your critical infrastructure, the better. Just reducing any chance of ignition in these areas is really key to success with having your overall structural survival. And then getting out to the extended zone. This is more of the area where you might start to encounter trees, or think in areas where you're having a solar installation, trees would be even pushed further back than this, just for concerns about shadowing and whatnot. But making sure that you do have that tree spacing, looking for 3 meters between trees, looking for elevating canopies at least 2 meters above ground, just to eliminate those ladder fuels. This is really where you're looking at, if you have forested area around, you're looking at managing and mitigating hazard within that forest in the hopes that you are able to drop down the fire intensity should a fire be encroaching on your site. Really, the purpose of this level of fuel mod isn't to necessarily stop the fire, but to just lower that intensity and get it back to a ground fire. And then if you've done your mitigation in the other zones, you've eliminated that ground hazard and effectively slowed down to stop the fire from getting even close to your critical infrastructure buildings and other pieces of critical infrastructure. So this, I put this graphic together because, again, we don't have necessarily anything that outlines the best way to mitigate around renewable infrastructure. So I excuse the how rudimentary this graphic is, but more or less, this is a couple of buildings, say, with a solar field. And just to sort of illustrate what this looks like as you have these immediate ignition zones and intermediate ignition zones really kind of overlapping. And looking at how to conceptualize like how to mitigate this whole site. So realistically, if you had a field of solar panels, my concern would be getting any heat even near those solar panels. So this consideration would be that to have an entire gravel area, to eliminate any sort of combustible material within any proximity to your solar panels. And then as well as conceptualizing how, ultimately the goal is to protect your structures, but should you mitigate one structure and not mitigate another, then you're adding more fuel. So trying to eliminate that sort of domino effect between mitigated and unmitigated, and really conceptualizing that if any building on site, when they start to interface their ignition zones, having the same level of approach and the same level of mitigation for all of those buildings is really going to be key to the overall survivability of your site. And then some additional considerations. I've pulled some of this from some of our other guidance. We came out this year in collaboration with Interior Health, some critical water infrastructure guidance where some of this comes from, and then just talking to some of my colleagues coming into this is some of their recommendations as well. So just mapping critical infrastructure and potential associated hazards, thinking about large battery banks, lithium batteries, those sorts of things, having that mapped and in a GIS file format that's available to first responders so people know, hey, there is this, not only is there this solar infrastructure out here or wind infrastructure out here, but there's a large battery bank that should the fire spread to these buildings, that's going to be a huge potential hazard for our personnel. And again, I'm not an expert on renewable energy, but I would think that there's going to be very specific heat and storage considerations for batteries. So looking at those HVAC considerations from earlier in the presentation, thinking about how to integrate the need to sort of isolate these buildings from the outside world, but then maintain cooling necessary so that you don't have a fire start inside buildings. And these are all considerations like this are something that can be discussed with the engineers and in the planning phase of installing these infrastructure projects. Making sure that there is an emergency response plan. So should you have a wildfire in the area, people working at the site know their roles and know who is the person that makes sure all the doors are closed. Those sorts of things are really key to just make sure that everything is getting done and not leaving it to chance. If you have any critical documents on site, making sure that there's offsite storage, whether that be cloud or other physical storage, and these might be critical operations documents, things like that. And just really thinking about making sure that you're not going to lose anything that will then hinder your startup upon reentry. So something to consider with critical infrastructure is, sure, we're going to have to more or less mothball the facility, shut it down, put it in a holding pattern while this natural disaster is occurring. But what does that startup look like after the fact, and making sure that you're set up, in the most advantageous position to really start back up and start providing that critical infrastructure for your community again, whether it be power, whether it be water, those sorts of things. And as well, when you're in this planning phase, a really kind of critical, a really good resource will be to reach out to your local fire departments and your local BC Wildfire fire centers or fire zones to get their expertise, to work with them to understand how to mitigate, how to coordinate that mitigation, other considerations that you might need from a response standpoint. Those are just a few. I'm sure there's, as we dig into this topic, there is potentially even more considerations, but those are some that came to me off the top of my head. And just wrapping up, here's a few FireSmart guides and resources. I can share a link to this presentation should anyone want a copy of it, and then you can follow these links. Just a few things that I highlighted, that obviously the critical infrastructure hazard guide, the critical infrastructure assessment form, begins at home guide. The farm and ranch wildfire preparedness was something that was flagged by a colleague of mine, just for these larger sites. When we start thinking about large scale solar farms, that's quite a bit of area, quite a few hectares potentially. So that might be a helpful resource for those larger areas. Just the FireSmart BC site, and then the Wildfire Mitigation Program Hub. For anyone familiar with FireSmart, this is the new rebranding of the Home Partners program. My colleagues who work on this program, they know the ins and outs of all our assessments. So should you have any questions about assessments, or maybe even best practices regarding critical infrastructure, it's a valuable resource to reach out to with those questions. And if you had any questions for me following this, you can reach out to me at research@firesmartbc.ca.